Today I'd like to talk about a very specific record. I was at the beach earlier in the week, and typically on vacation, when I'm traveling, I like to sniff out the local bookstores and the local record stores. And this trip was no exception. I found a really nice record shop, right downtown Ocean City, New Jersey. It was a small store, but it was a really well curated selection of CDs and vinyls. And when I was in there, I stumbled upon Swans' discography. Now, it didn't have every album of theirs, but they had a few, and the one that really jumped out to me personally was their second record, Cop. Now, Cop was not a record up until that point that I spent much time listening to. I was not really familiar with it actually at all. And so I was excited, between the sort of unknown of the record and just the sort of brutal album cover, the real intense red and black. I was really drawn towards it. Immediately, the cashier that was there, his face lit up, and I could tell from the moment I got there that he was a pretty big Swans fan. And it's not every day you come upon another Swans fan. And so he was really excited, and we talked for about 5 minutes, just kind of marveling at the longevity of this band's career and the wide range of sounds that they've been implementing in their records, from the very early sort of dirty and grimy New York era, all the way up till now. And so we were kind of just really excited talking about our sort of favorite Swans iterations, our favorite sort of Swans lineups. And it was quite nice, and it kind of made me even more enthusiastic to check out Cop, because again, at this point I had never really listened to it. A lot of the stuff in their back catalog I wasn't too familiar with. And a lot of that has to do with the sort of general online consensus of the record. For better or worse, I get a lot of I find a lot of music from the internet, sites like Rate Your Music. There's a whole plethora of YouTube channels that I look at. And Cop, despite sort of Swan's impact on the sort of online sphere, Cop is not one of the albums that seems to be talked about or discussed very much. Very rarely is Cop brought up. In fact, when it is brought up, it's usually compared to their debut record, Filth, just for its similarities, and even then, people tend to favor Filth, which is also a record that I have listened to quite a bit, actually. And so, despite my lack of knowledge, I was still excited to listen to the record. And after about a week with it, I've really kind of settled in with its sound. And I guess today, I'm not really interested in trying to sell you anything. I'm not trying to persuade you into thinking that this is actually the best Swans record. But I do have a few thoughts about the project, and I just feel like there's not any videos online, at least that I could find, really taking the record seriously, and I really think that you should. Although it might not be their most ambitious project, it might not be their most monumental project, I think it's just as quintessential as something like Soundtracks for the Blind or again, To Be Kind. And a lot of that revolves around the idea that I had, in that this is, in my mind, the darkest Swans record, and that's important because despite the sort of very diverse sonic landscape that Swans has dabbled in, what I think a lot of people come to expect when entering a Swans record is that darkness, is that sort of brooding, heavy unease. And that is probably the one thing that is most consistent throughout their entire career. And I want to make the argument that this record, Cop, is their darkest, and again is just as important as some of their more influential records. So what makes this album so dark? What makes it so dissonant and unsettling? I think the first thing that you're gonna see, I think the first thing that you're gonna see here or pick up on is its sound. Um, it has a lot of the same elements as Filth. You know, it's very abrasive, it's provocative, it's in your face, it's very metallic. It feels as if it's been, you know, being played live in some kind of weird industrial chamber. But what this album does different is it takes the sort of songs of Filth and really just strips them back even more to their bare bones. It kind of takes the hardest hitting moments and just kind of repeats them over and over again to the point where they do structurally become somewhat redundant, but it really gives it this like very off-kilter meditative quality to it that I think is quite effective. You know, and again, on top of that, the tempos are much lower, and so this time around, it has a very repetitive quality, and it feels as if you're kind of stuck or trapped in this nightmare, just running in place, and it's really quite jarring. There's really nothing like it in terms of in terms of like any other album. Sonically, it's just so grueling and taxing, and it has that industrial edge. It has that sort of metallic clang to it. It has the heavy drums, but it also is this sort of muck and this sort of filth, this sort of sludge that you're just kind of engulfed by. You're just kind of shrouded in, and I think it's effective. I think it works really well. I would recommend not going into this project expecting a really high quality collection of individual tracks. But treat it more as an experience, treat it more as just sort of a wall of sound or kind of an atmosphere or vibe that the band has created that you can kind of just get sucked into and sort of meditate over. So it's very harsh in sound, and Michael Gira's delivery here is no different. Now, he's a great performer. He sounds pretty consistently great on every record, but I would argue that this is maybe him in one of his best forms. Over top of these relentless beats, you essentially get these masochistic mantras from him. He's wailing, he's growling repeatedly over and over. It sounds almost as if these sort of lyrics, which we'll talk about in a second, the sort of content of the record, but again, it sounds as if he's like wailing these lines and they're just getting beaten out of him. It's as if he's been sort of trapped and beaten into submission, and he's just screaming over again this very sort of industrial, very sort of stripped back instrumentation that is predominantly just drums and guitars. It's very, very simple, but very concise and consistent. And that's one element that makes this album so dark and so interesting and unique. But the other side of this album that I think should really be analyzed is the lyrical content. This is just phenomenal writing on Gira's end. You know, what the songs are very sort of invested in, what Gira's really focused on is analyzing different types of power dynamics, different types of sort of very perverse and perverted relationships. You have songs like Half-Life and Job that sort of are really sort of explicit critiques of capitalism and the effects that capitalism has on sort of collective people, how it kind of reduces us to sort of meat or bodies that are really here to sort of just complete a very specific task. In a sense, it's very utilitarian, and just again highlights through this sound the sort of grueling effects that it has on us, the way it kind of treats us as this kind of dissonant, kind of like cog in the machine, and it's really quite taxing. It's very you know, I don't use this word lightly, but it's very traumatic. On songs like Your Property, he analyzes the relationship or that sort of master and slave dichotomy between landlords and tenants. You know, on this sort of very, very heavy sound, he's he's just screaming the words over and over again. You own me, you own me, you own me. And it becomes a bit degrading. And the same thing can be said for Cop. Again, it's kind of breaking down this sort of weird power dynamic that sort of these authority figures, these oppressors have on the sort of common person, and the effects that brings. A lot of the times it feels as if Michael Gira's just sort of peeling away at our human autonomy. And I think what makes it even more bleak, as if it couldn't get any bleaker, is that there's no sort of solace. There's no escape. There's no moment of brevity throughout this entire runtime. There's no sort of guide or manual on sort of how to sort of transcend this sort of muck and filth and this sort of injustice. There's no revolution taking place. It's a bit defeating. Gira oftentimes sounds helpless. Again, it sounds like he's being beaten into submission. And when you have a song like Why Hide, where he's repeating the words, why hide, why hide, why hide, it kind of has this level of hopelessness to it all, which again, I think adds to the darkness. A lot of this record actually reminds me of a painting, Saturn Devouring His Son, painted by Francisco de Goya. And if you're familiar with this work, this comes rather late in de Goya's career. This comes after Napoleon kind of invades Spain. This comes after Spain's after Spain crumbles, the Constitution gets dismantled. And he paints this work of art, directly onto the wall of his villa. At this point he's suffering from very severe psychosis. He's deaf. He's isolated, alone, and he really does have a sort of boiling hatred toward the sort of lost progress and the very sort of aristocratic class at large. And I think this translates into his rendition of Saturn Devouring His Son. I think it's quite an effective piece. I think, again, it like Cop, it highlights the idea that sort of our autonomy, and in this case, our anatomy is just being peeled away by the powers that be, and it's consuming us. It's our oppressors. It's the oppression that we endure that will inevitably kill us, and there's really no way out of it. But what I also love about this rendition is the way he depicts Saturn. In this rendition, he kind of strips away all of his sort of godlike attributes and really reduces him down to sort of this sort of primitive animal who is also simultaneously very conscious and aware of this sort of act that he's committing, this sort of atrocity. And I suppose if you're not familiar with the piece, I should just say, essentially what it's depicting is Saturn the god becomes aware of the fact that his sort of power is fleeting, and eventually it's his children that will reign over the world. And in a sort of desperate attempt to sort of cling to that sort of godlike status that he has, he goes out and devours his offspring. And again, in Goya's interpretation of it, there's this sort of fragility to Saturn's posture. There's, it feels as if you kind of stumble upon him committing this act, and he's just full of regret and humility. And I think that's kind of what Cop does, It takes this power dynamic, this, again, very sort of gross and perverted power dynamic, and really shows both sides of the coin. It really shows how it kind of hinders and affects all of us. And it really captures the frustration and hatred that kind of goes into it, that kind of sort of wears us down to our bones. And it's important. Cop is as important as Goya's masterpiece, and I believe it should be taken seriously. I said I was going to make the argument that this is Swans' darkest album, and I truly believe that. And I believe that because it is explicitly political in tone. It's explicitly political in its messaging, and its atmosphere that it creates, and its delivery. And again, I think Swans just captures that feeling, that sort of nihilism, unlike anything else. So yeah, it is by far their darkest record, and I hope I've convinced you to at least check it out. It is certainly worth your time, despite the sort of torment that it might bring.